Martin Luther King, born Michael Luther King, was an extraordinary citizen of America, citizen of the world, and proud African American. Martin Luther King, in my estimation, is one of a handful of the most important Americans to ever live. It's hard to say who are the top 3, top 5, top 10, but no list of influential Americans could ever be written with any degree of credibility and it not include the contributions of Martin Luther King, who in effect was the leader of whether one calls it the second or the third chapter in the American Revolution/evolution. Martin Luther King. I think it is helpful, it's important, it's necessary, it's needed for us to continue to celebrate Dr. King's birthday every year. But I often pause and wonder if in the mainstream of popular recognition, if what the national media does, which is play a very short clip of powerful words that Dr. King uttered at the 1963 March on Washington, powerful words about the dream that he had, if that short snippet does complete and absolute justice to this man's contributions. Because it's common to understand and to know Martin Luther King as a powerful orator, as someone that could grasp a crowd and speak with the King's English, alternating from prose to poetry in such a flawless fashion with not a single error in enunciation or pronunciation. It's common to think of this great man as simply this powerful orator, this inspirational figure. And he is, and let us never take away from him, all of that. But ladies and gentlemen, he was so much more. And the reason why he's so much more, the reason why a complete analysis and a complete study and a complete discussion about who he was is necessary is because if we are going to role model ourselves as leaders or as citizens after his work, we must understand him past the caricature, which today is not an unfavorable caricature, but what I might say is an incomplete caricature. So in addition to being this great orator, in addition to being this inspirational leader, what else was Martin Luther King? Martin Luther King was a brilliant strategist, a strategist who didn't mind working against the grain. So when Martin Luther King hit the public scene for the first time in 1955, it was after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery as a part of an effort that had been organized by the local chapter of the NAACP to challenge the city ordinance in Montgomery, which required passengers on a bus to sit separately as a result of race. And Martin Luther King was thrust into a position of leadership. And in that position of leadership as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, Martin Luther King seized upon the idea and the notion that it was not enough to challenge segregation in the courts, that it was necessary to also do it with the use of direct action, which in Montgomery resulted in a boycott or an economic protest. Now, I might remind you that this is 1955. It's but 1 year after the most important Supreme Court decision in American history. The case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas had been decided 9-0, argued by Thurgood Marshall, a lawsuit architected and envisioned in the 1940s, not simply by Thurgood, but mostly by that time, the late Charles Hamilton Houston, the dean of the law school at Howard University. And the leaders of the approach of using the courts to knock down the walls of segregation were absolutely horrified that this 26-year-old preacher from Atlanta, who was down in Montgomery, somehow thought that boycotts and marches were necessary. Marshall was livid. The people in the NAACP were livid. They felt that the way to achieve the end of segregation was primarily and simply by using the course of litigation. After all, on their side, they had a 9-0 decision of the United States Supreme Court, which they felt was precedent enough to go throughout the South, go throughout the lower courts, and use that precedent to slowly but effectively whittle away at the segregation statutes and ordinances, which had been on the books in many of these southern cities and states. Martin Luther King, however, had studied Mahatma Gandhi and had a vision that the battle in the courts needed to be buttressed by, needed to be enhanced by a challenge which was based not simply on the Constitution, not simply on law, but based on the morality. That underneath the laws of segregation, underneath separate water fountains and separate schools, was just an immoral system and an immoral notion which separated human beings simply because of the hue of their skin. So in bringing direct action and in bringing the idea of direct action, Martin Luther King was a strategist who was willing to go against orthodoxy at the time. Martin Luther King also went against the orthodoxy of what many people thought was the role of a, quote, church leader or a minister. Apropos to those times, not only did Thurgood Marshall and many others deeply resent some of what Martin Luther King was doing in those early days, so did someone by the name of Joseph Jackson. Joseph Jackson was a very powerful person in the 1950s. He was president of the National Baptist Convention USA, the umbrella organization of all Baptist churches, African-American Baptist churches in America. Jackson believed that preachers should stay out of politics, that ministers and pastors had no role in civil rights. Why do I point this out? Because here was a 26-year-old, newly minted PhD, wet behind the ears, with the elder leaders of those times saying that what Martin Luther King was about to do was about to reverse the many years of progress that they had worked towards with the victory in Brown. So Martin Luther King, in addition to being an orator, in addition to being a strategist, Martin Luther King was an irritant. He was a generational irritant. He was a young man pushing against the conventions of the time by saying that ministers, if they were true to the gospel, if they were true to the New Testament teachings, if they were true to what they preached in the pulpit, had a duty and a responsibility to challenge immorality in the lives of their members, in the lives of their parishioners. So Martin Luther King, he was once an orator, he was a strategist, and he was an irritant. Martin Luther King was also a man of tremendous humility. Tremendous humility. For example, it is common for many to say that the March on Washington was devised by and organized by Martin Luther King. The March on Washington was not devised by nor organized by Martin Luther King. The March on Washington in 1963 was devised by and organized by a man by the name of A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph. Asa Philip Randolph. There's a statue of him in Union Station in Washington, D.C. Who was A. Philip Randolph? He was the president and founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was a prominent union leader. He was the only African-American member of the AFL-CIO Executive Committee in the 1940s, and the 1950s, and the 1960s. Now, Randolph had threatened in 1941. He had threatened President Franklin Roosevelt with a mass march on Washington because he was challenging segregation and challenging the availability of jobs in wartime industries for African Americans and people of color. King would even say that it was Randolph who organized the March on Washington, and that King was simply a participant in a team of people, a team of organizations, which included the National Urban League and the NAACP and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Council of Racial Equality, and all of these organizations teamed together to organize the March on Washington. King was humble. King never, in any book he wrote, in any speech he gave, in any interview he uttered, ever said, "I organized," or the March of Washington was indeed all about me. Now, the truth is, because of King's prowess as an orator, the leaders of the march scheduled Martin Luther King to be one of the last speakers of the day. The fear was that if King spoke early, everyone would listen and then leave. So King was one of the last speakers of the day. And ladies and gentlemen, if you go to YouTube, you can look at the complete and full proceedings of all of the speakers who spoke at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. King was a humble man, a man who did not seek credit for himself, but for whom teamwork and collaboration and participation with others was certainly at his prime. So Martin Luther King was a humble man. Martin Luther King was also a man who believed in creative confrontation. Creative confrontation. And the most important window into that creative confrontation may have to do, and if those of you who saw the movie Selma saw the interaction between Johnson and King in early 1965. King believed in creative confrontation. You see, originally, the 1964 Civil Rights Act had a section or a provision in it which would have given voting rights and voting rights protections to African Americans. But Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, in his effort to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Johnson, in his ability to bring a recalcitrant Congress along with the Civil Rights Act of '64, after the death of Kennedy, after the March on Washington, agreed with the deletion of the voting rights provisions from the proposed Civil Rights Act of 1964 for fear that those provisions would in fact render the bill, the original 1964 bill, unpassable. Nonetheless, once the bill passed, Johnson was proud of himself. After all, he had broken a Senate filibuster. Sound common? Sound familiar? A Senate filibuster that had been in effect since 1947, where the Senate had filibustered any civil rights bill since the 1940s until Johnson was able to break the filibuster in the 1960s. Now here's the point. After the Civil Rights Act passed, King, understanding and believing the momentum, and with the spring of 1965 dawning, decided that it was time to press Johnson and the Congress even further for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The rest is history. Selma occurred. The Selma confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge flashed across the screens of American television sets. Johnson, resistant to the idea, saying to King, wait, 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 relented, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. I point this out to you, ladies and gentlemen, because to understand the manner of a man, we must understand him beyond his popular caricature, which indeed is not a negative caricature, but what I would submit to you is an incomplete caricature of a man who was deeply and intensely strategic, a man who at the same time as being a great, powerful orator who could command a stage, a man of tremendous humility, a man with a great sense of strategy, a man not afraid to confront or irritate conventions of strategy, or also the notions held by powerful people like Lyndon Johnson, who were indeed his ally. This man was a brilliant man and a great man. So we have to understand what he was all about to then ask another important question. And that question is, how does what King stood for and talked about matter today? So I think if King were here today, the first place I would take Martin Luther King is I would take him to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, I wouldn't tell him who he was going to see. I wouldn't give him a hint of a thing. I'd just say we need to go over there and check in on the president. And I'm confident that if Martin Luther King walked into the Oval Office and saw Barack Obama sitting behind that desk, he would probably say, "When is the president coming?" He would be shocked. He'd be surprised. And indeed, he would be pleased. He would view it as a very important accomplishment for a nation, a very important accomplishment, maybe even beyond the vision that he so eloquently articulated in the 1960s. But then if I gave Martin Luther King and said, Dr. King, sit down, after he shook hands with the president, after he exchanged pleasantries with the president, I said, Dr. King, let me sit you down for a briefing on 21st century America. And I would start by saying, you know, Dr. King, let me share this with you. Today, there are nearly 10,000 elected officials around the nation who happen to be African American. And he'd shake his head and nod in agreement and with pride. I'd say, you know, Dr. King, today, if you look at the corporate suites of America, there have been no less than maybe 10 or 15 African American men and women, and if you add women and Latinos, it may be 20 to 25, that have held the highest position, the chief executive officer's job in America's Fortune 500 companies. And Dr. King, even though we know it doesn't go far enough, would nod indeed in assent. And then if I simply went down all of the important accomplishments, the people who have been recognized, the individual accomplishments which are considerable, Dr. King would nod in agreement. He would smile with some consent. But then if I said, you know, but Dr. King, let me share some other challenging statistics with you. Dr. King, did you know that in any given year in America, 10,000 people die as a result of gun violence? And Dr. King, did you know that still in too many communities across the nation, police misconduct and police violence leads to the death of unarmed, particularly black men? And did you know, Dr. King, that while we have made tremendous progress, that today in America, America leads the world, yes, in GDP, yes, in PhDs, America leads the world in number of automobiles owned on a per capita basis. But America also leads the world in the number of guns owned by its own people, leads the world in the number of prisoners on a per capita basis than any other country in the world. And did you know, Dr. King, that even today, notwithstanding GDP in the $15 trillion range in this country, did you know that still 26% of your citizens of color and 10% of your white citizens still live in poverty in America today? Dr. King would say, you know, my son, my grandson, my children, you've made tremendous progress and I'll compliment you. But I'm not satisfied for one bit that you can't do better, that you shouldn't do better, that you ought not do better. He would challenge this generation to try to tackle this tremendous unfinished business, this rising gap between haves and have-nots, this stifling challenge we have with simply trying to ensure that every child born in America, regardless of zip code, has the same pathway to a quality education so that they can become a productive worker and fulfill the career vision that they might have. This stifling rate of violence in this country that has been so powerful, it's been numbing. Whether it's violence by one citizen against another citizen, violence by a police officer on a citizen, the killing of a citizen, of a police officer. It's too much violence for 21st century America to tolerate. Why are you so silent? Why are you so accepting? Why do you believe it's got to be this way? Dr. King, like a wise father, would admonish us while complimenting us about the tremendous unfinished work. And he would remind young people, that his life as a man of difference and a man of leadership and a man of distinction began when he was 26 years of age. He'd remind us that when he stood before the statue of Lincoln and uttered those words of tremendous eloquence, he was but 34 years of age. And he'd say, remember that in those days and in those times, America was led by a president elected at the age of 43, with an attorney general in his late 30s, and that all of the leaders of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, with the exception of A. Philip Randolph, were primarily people who were 40 and under. He would say that the transformation and the change that this country needs will come from its young. It will come from today's students. It will come from the millennial generation. It'll come from emerging leaders. It will come from those who understand that what we build today will affect the lives they live tomorrow. So, University of Rochester, as we remember Dr. Martin Luther King, as we think about his tremendous achievements and his tremendous accomplishments, let us not pigeonhole the life and the work of this man into a simple caricature of an orator who uttered great words. Let us not see him as an idle dreamer or simply a thinker. Let us remember him as a man of deep spirituality, a man of action, a man of humility, a man of confrontation, a man who was not afraid to run against the grain, a man who was not afraid to challenge generational conventions of those times. And let us carry his message forth. At a time when we are witnesses to a debates and discussions around who will be the next leader of the free world, that sometimes make you wonder if you're looking at a 21st century version of the Three Stooges or a human transformation of SpongeBob, Patrick, and the Star. Whether you're looking at Saturday Night Live transformed into Wednesday night cable TV. Dr. King would also remind us that hope and civility, that faith in the future, that we are strong if we don't turn on each other, but we turn to each other. And that the idea and the notion that America can move forward in the 21st century by building walls instead of bridges, by erecting barriers and bans instead of building a symphony or an orchestra of voices for justice and freedom, that if America embraces that, then America will be turning the hands back. But if America re-embraces the vision of an America where children from any race and any background and any creed will and can join together with children of any other race, background, and creed to transform this nation into a 21st century citadel of freedom and justice for all, then we will have fulfilled his work and completed his vision. So on this, the 29th day of February, Dr. King, I apologize, we're a little late, but happy birthday, Dr. Martin Luther King.
A production of the University of Rochester. Please visit us online and subscribe to our channel for more videos.